Welcome to the Ravens Vail Coven. The Coven features short, independent stories with themes ranging from dark horror and fantasy to any other disturbing fiction. The Coven contains stories written outside the ongoing storyline of the Ravens Vail universe. The stories are submitted by listeners, authors, and storytellers and are carefully curated by the staff of Ravens Vail. To learn about our guidelines for submitting your story for consideration, go to www.ravensvail.com and click on the Submission tab on the menu bar.
The Ravens Vail Coven is part of our Dark Fantasy Horror Anthology podcast and may contain explicit language or thematic elements not suitable for all audiences. Listener discretion is advised.
Our next storyteller was born and raised among the rivers and mountains in West Virginia, but now calls Tennessee home. Stories, whether read, heard, told, or performed, have always allowed him to travel to distant lands, both real and imaginary. He's the father of our headliner. Please put your hands together and welcome Nate Smith.
So the story I'm going to tell this evening is a story called Dark Katrina. And this story came to me when I was traveling to the Toronto Storytelling Festival a few years ago, pre-COVID, as we like to call. And I got to go to this storytelling festival, and this storyteller, his name was Jamie Olivero, and he told this story, and I pulled him aside later, and I was like, where did you hear this story? He said, I got this story from a man named Robin Moore. He's a storyteller and writer from Pennsylvania, and he had put this story in his collection of books. He himself had gotten this story from oral tradition and kind of modified it to his own. So from oral storytellers of old to Robin Moore to Jamie Olivero, from me to you, I'm going to share Dark Katrina with you. So the Appalachian Mountains, they're old. They're the oldest mountains in the world. They're rough, they're craggy, the valleys are dark and deep, and we don't know all the things that are there. There's things hidden and unspoken. And that's part of why we're here this evening, isn't it? To hear some of those stories. In the mountains of Pennsylvania, there's a place called the Seven Mountain Range. And it's part of the Appalachian Mountains, just like the Great Smoky Mountains. And in that region, once upon a time, I don't know, somewhere 150, 200 years ago, there lived a man, actually a young man, named Fiddlin Jack. Now, Fiddlin Jack, he was an amazing fiddler. He traveled all over that region, and he would play for weddings, funerals, he'd play for dances. Anywhere he had the opportunity to play, he would play his fiddle, and people would come from all around. Now, he was sort of traditionally trained. His father played the fiddle. His father taught him a few tunes, but they were just the regular tunes that everybody played. When Jack became the amazing fiddler that he was to become, it was because he would go out on his own, and he would listen to the sounds that were all around him, the sounds of the owls and the hawks, and the deer and the bear, the bubbling brooks, the ice on the streams breaking up in winter, the snow falling, the wind through the trees. And he wove all of those sounds into his music until it was something that nobody had ever heard before. And it was those sounds that at those dances got people's feet up and moving. It was like magic woven into every song he played. And that magic was especially powerful when it came to the ladies. Now, we know that can cause some trouble, and we'll see where that gets Jack. But Jack had to live by the seasons, because we all know that if you're a fiddler, you aren't going to make a living doing that. So he would live by the seasons. During the spring, he would go and plow fields and plant seeds. In the summer, he would harvest blackberries or do any other kind of odd jobs. In the fall, he would help with the harvest. And in the winter, he would hunt wolves. Now, the wolves have been in those Pennsylvania mountains for longer than any of us knew. They ran in packs all over the place, and they were dangerous. They would come down out of the mountains, especially at night when the winter got cold and hard and they couldn't find their regular food source. They would come down off the mountains and they would sneak into the farms and they would kill everything from the dogs to the chickens, and sometimes they would even take down calves. And that's the living of those farmers. And so they decided that they would pay money, $25. Now, $25 to us now doesn't seem like that much, but 200 years ago, $25 was a lot of money. And so he got into this job because one day he had heard about this. It was a good way to make money, and he had gone to a dance. He was playing at this dance at Draper's Meadow. It was at the corner of a place called Black Moshan Creek, and it was up in this holler in this meadow. He was playing this dance, and he saw this girl there. And he was blown away. But she was sitting over by herself with an older man off to the side. And so somewhere in the middle of this dance, and now he would play the fiddle, but he didn't just play. He actually danced and played at the same time. And so during a break from this fiddling, he stepped to the side and he asked his friend, he's like, who is that over there? This girl with the long, beautiful hair and deep, dark eyes. And she was tall and straight, and her movements were all graceful. He was amazed. And he said, that is Dark Katrina. He's like, she's beautiful. How come nobody's dancing with her? He's like, everybody's kind of afraid of her. And it's like, why? He's like, there's just something about her. So Jack, not daunted, walks over. And he said, hello, how are y'all? And he was talking to her father. Her father was known as Sheriff McKee around those parts. He was the guy that paid out the money for the wolves. And he said, I hear that you need some people to hunt wolves. He said, are you as good with a rifle as you are with a fiddle? And he said, I'm even better. He said, well, come winter, Fiddlin Jack, if you come and see me, I think we can find some work for you. He said, would your daughter like to dance? She just kind of smiled at him just a little on the edge of her lips. She said, I don't dance. And looked straight ahead. Jack was undaunted, but kind of said, okay. He's like, I'll come and see you. And that was more than incentive enough for him to come and to Sheriff McKee's farm and hunt wolves that winter. And that's just what he did. He went up there, he talked to the sheriff who met him at the door, and he said, yeah, you can hunt on my property up on mountain. It's Bald Eagle Mountain. And they said at the bottom of Bald Eagle Mountain on a place called, in a hollow that was fed by a spring, and it was called Spring Creek. And so all winter long, he was given a place to sleep in the hay in the barn, and he would go out on moonlit nights. Not like you can now. You can walk around with a flashlight, but then you had to have the moon to hunt by. That was the only way that he could see the wolves. And he would go up on the ridge, and he would track the wolves. Now, again, like I said, Fiddlin Jack had a way of weaving all those sounds from nature into his fiddling, and that's how he got the wolves to come to him. He would go up there, and he would get 2 sticks, and he would find a place on the edge of a clearing that was kind of back in the woods, kind of in the dark in a way, so he could see that moon shining down into that clearing. And he would stick 1 stick on one side of him, and a stick on the other. And he'd put his fiddle and bow over here. He'd put his rifle over here. And as soon as he saw the moon come out, he would pick up that fiddle and he'd start slowly. He'd make howling sounds with that fiddle. And he'd draw those. He could hear the wolves respond, and he would draw them down the mountain to where he was at. And so one particular night, he's out there, and he's on the edge of this clearing, and he's ready. and he hears this howl, and he can tell that it's not a normal wolf, it's a she-wolf. And he starts playing, and soon the wolves come down the mountain. He can hear the sound of them getting closer, and he sees this large, dark she-wolf enter the circle of the clearing. And as she does, he puts that fiddle and bow down on one side. He reaches over and picks up his rifle, and he slowly cocks it back. And he waits, and he takes aim, and snap. But nothing happens. And she hears it. Her head turns towards him. Now, most of the time when this is happening, it happens. Those rifles are not that good all the time. Flint doesn't always strike. The powder can be wet. But this time, instead of running away like most of the normal wolves do, this wolf looked at him and took one long stride, two long strides. And on the third stride towards him, that she-wolf jumped in the air, and his rifle was done. And so he pulled from his belt the one thing he had left, a large butcher knife. And he fell backwards and swung with it. And when he swung, he heard a loud yelp. And that wolf rolled in the snow and stood up and looked at him and then ran off. Now, he came back down that mountain. He was kind of shaken. He'd never been hunted by the wolf. He'd only hunted them. And so he went down that evening and went back to the barn and went to sleep. And in the morning, he got up and he knocked on the door at the house. And Katrina answered the door. And while she said, "You want to come in for some coffee?" He said, "Yeah." And he looked down, and there her hand was bandaged. And he could see the blood coming through. He's like, "Katrina, what happened?" She said, "I wasn't careful with a butcher knife last night." He was like, "Oh, okay." And so he came in and he had the coffee, and Sheriff McKee came in and he said, "Did you get a wolf last night?" "No, sir, I didn't, but I'll get her tonight." So he went back out. He took his rifle. He cleaned it, made sure everything was good, went out to the back of the farm. There was an old stump there in the snow. He took aim at it, and he heard click, pop. In just a split second, that spark ignited, and boom, that rifle shot, and that stump exploded. Snow showered everywhere. And he was like, "I'm ready to go." So he went and took a nap, and then he went back up that mountain. But he wanted some extra insurance because, all he was left with was that butcher knife that worked last time. So this time he had this old horse pistol. You kind of just stuff it with whatever you got, nails, metal, extra bullets. And so he took that horse pistol with him. He kind of stuffed it in the pocket of his big coat. He had his butcher knife, he had his rifle, and he had his fiddle and bow, and he headed up the mountain that night. Moonlight, sat on the edge of a clearing, back in the woods. He started playing the fiddle, and he could hear the wolves howl, starting to come down the mountain towards him. And as they entered the clearing, he quietly set his fiddle and bow down over here, picked that rifle up, took careful aim. That big black she-wolf was right there again. And he lined up the sights, and click! It happened again. and that she-wolf looked at him. In one stride, two strides, and on the third stride, she leaped towards him, and it was all he could do to pull that horse pistol up and out, and he got a shot off. And he heard a yowl and a yelp, and that wolf rolled across on the other side of him, and he's laying on his back in the snow, and he's out of breath and scared, and he rolls over, and he sees that wolf kind of sit up and shake it off, and he sees it run off, but he can see that it's running with a limp. Well, he's shaken up. He can't do that again. So the next day, later that evening, he goes back down to the barn. He's going to just sleep. And he gets up the next morning, and he goes, knocks on the door, and Katrina answers the door. She said, "Would you like some coffee this morning?" And this time her smile's just a little bit bigger, like she knows something that he doesn't know. And he looks down. The bottom of the hem of her dress, he can see that her right foot is wrapped up and a bandage. And you can see a little blood coming through, and he's like, what happened? She's like, oh, those old horse pistols, you just don't know what will happen when they go off. He said, about this time, Jack is starting to think, boys, it takes them a while. And he's like, oh, dear. And so Sheriff McKee comes down. He said, did you get me a wolf last night? He said, no, sir, but I'll get her tonight. So Jack gets everything ready, and he tracks that wolf with the bloody footprint. He goes back up in the woods on the ridge, and during that day, he kind of spends some time. He's like, to figure out what's going on, I'm going to need to go take another nap. It's always good to take a nap before you go on an adventure, right? And he goes and takes a nap so he can be up all night again. And he follows those tracks, and they lead to the back of the house. They don't lead to the back of the house, specifically to the window to Dark Katrina's room. And so later that evening, and you should never do this, but he sneaks up to the back of the house and peers in through the window, and he sees Dark Katrina there sitting at her table, looking at her mirror, brushing her hair. And he can kind of see her lips moving, and she's counting 50 to 60, and at 100 she stops. She puts down the brush, and he sees her reach up with both her hands, grabs her hair, and just yanks. And he's at the window going, what? And under there, he sees two giant wolf ears sticking out, black as her hair. Sees wolf head, and he's watching through the window. He sees her take her thumb, has a long, sharp fingernail on it. She puts it in the middle of her forehead and just brings it down hard and cuts it. And then she starts peeling, almost like an apple peel. Slowly unwraps her skin and takes it and drops it in a wicker basket next to her table. And then she drops down on all fours. And then she walks over to the window and kind of nudges it open. And at this point, he's dropped down to the edge of the house, makes himself as small as possible. And the next thing he knows, he sees that wolf leap through the window over him and off into the night. He's like, what should I do? So he's got a plan. He climbs in through that window, and he brought his fiddle with him. He brought his gun with him. So he took off his coat. There was a nice fire going. And he laid his coat down on the bed with his gun. And he took that fiddle out. He was going to say, I can work some magic with my fiddle. Let's see if it'll work here. So as not to wake Sheriff McKee and his wife, he slowly starts to play. Just one of those tunes that gets people moving real quiet-like. And slowly, but surely, that skin in that basket starts to swirl around. It starts to take the form of Dark Katrina. He plays another tune that kind of gets your feet moving. And that form starts to sway. Now he walks over, picks up her hair off the table and puts it back on and drapes a robe across her. As he does that, he kind of feels a cold breeze from behind him. He's like, oh, the window's open. There's no reason I should leave that open. As he turns over and looks through the window, he sees two bright eyes in the night, reflecting the moonlight. And he takes a step back, and as he takes a step back, that wolf, a dark she-wolf, leaps through the window and jumps onto that skin that's Dark Katrina, rolls around 3 times on the floor, and up pops Dark Katrina. No more hollow eyes now. It's her deep, wild eyes that he had seen at that fiddling contest. And so at this point, he's so stunned, he doesn't know what to do. And he thought his plan had been to use the magic of his fiddle to kind of calm her down. But he's so stunned, he can't even do that. And before he can do anything or even make a move, she starts to hum a low tune almost under her breath. and there's nothing he can do. And she pulls him over ever so gently and sets him down at her table. Looking at the mirror, she stands behind him and keeps humming her tune. She slowly picks up her brush. 150, gets to 100. She reaches up. After she set down the brush with both hands, she grabs hold of his hair and just yank. And there's nothing he can do. He's powerless. But there in the mirror, he sees 2 large wolf ears sticking up and a dark gray fur. And she takes that finger and she reaches around him with that thumb and slits his forehead open and starts to unpeel his skin, just like she did her own, and drops it to the floor. And then he hops down on all fours. He can smell things that he's never smelled before, the pine trees and the snow. He can smell the animals that have moved around and behind the house. And then Katrina stands up. She takes off her skin and becomes a wolf again. And the 2 of them hop through the window and head out into the woods and run like wolves. He'd never felt anything like it before. The power surging through his body, the wind passing through his hair, the smells, the nights in the warm dens on the mountain. And when they come back to the farm, Jack never leaves. In fact, he and Katrina start to raise a family there. And when old Sheriff McKee and his wife pass, they take over the farm. And on the nights that are right, they take their whole family out as wolves and run those hills. And would spend nights hunting and gathered together, howling. Now, that was 150, 200 years ago, and the wolves are gone from Pennsylvania. They don't exist there anymore, but people that live around Bald Eagle Mountain still say they can go out there, and they can hear the sounds of those wolves. And there's one old man in particular. Now, some say he would get into the bottle a lot, but he said one night he followed the sound of that fiddle. It was a moonlit night. He followed the sound of that fiddle up into the mountains. And when he got up there in the mountains, he said there was this moonlit clearing. And he heard beside it, he could see the skin of Jack, hollow eyes, sitting on a log, playing a fiddle tune. And under that bright moonlight in that clearing, he could see the skin, the form of Katrina twirling and spinning in the moonlight.
Great.
Ravens Vail Coven is a production of Small Raven Media. Audio engineering and sound design by Nick Devan at Nicky D Sound. Copyrighted 2023 by Small Raven Media. All rights reserved.